Good morning, everyone, and I guess no surprise, I am Jack Rotherham, publisher of The Hill. Welcome to this morning's event, Leadership in Action, Criminal Justice Reform. I would like to begin by thanking our sponsors, American University's School of Public Affairs and the Kennedy Political Union. We are grateful for your continued partnership and support. The U.S. Congress recently passed what is being heralded as the most significant and sweeping criminal justice reform legislation in nearly a decade. The bipartisan First Step Act not only eases mandatory minimum sentences under federal law, but also puts more of an emphasis on vocational and rehabilitation programs in prisons. Today, we will be hearing from key lawmakers and experts about what immediate results we can expect to see in federal prisons across the country now that the First Step Act has been signed into law. Our conversations will also delve into the situation at the state and local levels, the restoration of voting rights for ex-felons, and the racial inequities that pervade our penal system. But first, a few quick housekeeping notes. In addition to our audience here at the museum, we are also live streaming on thehill.com, so behave. Please keep your phones on silent throughout the duration of the program, but we do encourage you to engage in the conversation on social media. In fact, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at The Hill Events and join the conversation using the hashtag TheHillCJR. We are going to be taking questions from the audience during the program, so please be on the lookout for members of our team with handheld mics. And finally, you will receive an electronic survey following the conclusion of today's event. We are always eager at The Hill to hear how we can make our events more dynamic, and your inputs are very important to us. I encourage you to take a few moments to provide your feedback on today's program. So let's dive right in. We begin this morning with Congressman Jim Clyburn, a Democrat from South Carolina and a seasoned veteran on the Hill. Congressman Clyburn now serves as the House Majority Whip. He has been a tireless advocate for criminal justice reform since he first came to Congress in 1993, now over 25 years ago. Joining the Congressman on stage is my colleague, The Hill's Bob Cusack, our editor-in-chief. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Jack. Congressman, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
First off, news of the day, we have a big vote in the House today that would nullify President Trump's emergency declaration. This is going to pass, but do you expect every Democrat to vote for it?
I do, though I'm often surprised by some of my colleagues. But I do expect to have almost unanimous, if not unanimous, vote. And I think we'll pick up some Republicans. I don't know how many.
What significance is it? Because now there's a big question. It looks like the Senate will also pass it because it can't be filibustered. But what would be the significance of sending this to the White House? It would be vetoed. But do you think that might help the court case in court? Because obviously this is already being challenged.
Well, for me, it will help in the court of public opinion. And I think that's the most concern that we have, whether or not the public really understands what this is about. Mm-hmm. And so if we were to pass this, it goes over to the president, he vetoes it. It gives us an opportunity to explain to the public exactly what's going on here. And I would love to see the president try to defend violating the constitutional parameters like this, and that would really help us with the public.
Criminal justice reform, what was the key in this volatile time? You had this unusual spirit of bipartisanship. This was not easy to get done. This has been years in the making. But what was the key in getting it to, number one, pass the House, and then there were some changes because a number of Democrats didn't like the first version, but then all of them voted for the final version. Who were some of the key players, and how did this get done in such a volatile political time?
Well, I think on the Democratic side, you had Hakeem Jeffries, who did a great job of working with Doug Collins, who I think you're going to have on later, in making this a bipartisan effort. Cedric Richmond, this is a big thing for him. Cedric at the time chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and now assistant to the Democratic whip. Cedric did a great role. Sheila Jackson Lee. These people really worked together to try to do what was necessary to get a bipartisan effort and to really do what it says, take some first steps. You know, I grew up in the South. We tend to use adages a lot, and that old adage, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that's what we did here. We took a step, irrespective of the fact that a lot of the third-party people outside the civil rights communities did not particularly like this bill, wanting us to hold out for citizen reform and that sort of thing. But we went forward because I'm a firm believer that we ought not sacrifice good on the altar of perfect. And that's what we were doing. So we did this, we took the first step, and luckily the bill was not in the Senate 20 minutes. That's an old thing that I say all the time. I don't know how long it was there, but it absolutely got fair citizen attached to it. And so when it got back to the House, we were able to all vote for it, which to me is important for us to keep in mind that so often in getting legislation to pass, you need to take the incremental steps. I often hear people talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and how comprehensive that was. Few people realize that that so-called 1964 Civil Rights Act came into being over a period of 8 years. 64, we got outlawed discrimination in employment in the private sector. We didn't get voting until 65, we didn't get housing until 68, and we didn't get the public sector covered by the Voting Rights Act until 1972. So when you talk about these things, you may sound like you got this big ominous bill, but it happened over a period of time. So I think we're going to take some second steps, some third steps, and fourth steps. I think in the end, incrementally, we're going to have a pretty good, comprehensive criminal justice reform bill.
Will that be, speaking of the next step, because this was called the First Step Act?
Yes.
Is that going to be a focal point of the new majority in the House Democratic agenda to take the next step to push more legislation?
Absolutely. There are some things left out of this bill. One that bothers me a whole lot is this 18-to-1 crack powder cocaine deal. When I got to Congress, it was 100-to-1. And it was passed in an environment that was a little different than people realize. I'll never forget one of the most contentious meetings I ever had was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, when I came out against this 100-to-1 deal, and I was just, people went crazy. There wasn't, everybody in that audience was black, but everybody in that audience attacked me for being against this 100-to-1 crack cocaine thing, because crack cocaine was a scourge in African-American communities, and they wanted it out. And so they supported this, only to find out later how it could be misused. I worked with Bobby Scott. The two of us worked very hard after an incident that took place in Virginia involving a young lady who was driving an automobile. Her boyfriend was arrested, and she was charged. And she got 12 or 13 years. And she was driving a car, and I'm not too sure she knew what her boyfriend was doing. So we worked on this. We got it reduced down to 18, where it is now. When we passed this bill, we made the 18-to-1 relief retroactive, but it's still in place going forward. So to say we're going to let the people out who were convicted under 18-to-1, but we're still going to continue to convict people under 18-to-1, that's like taking one step forward and two backwards, in my opinion.
Because a lot of the stories that you hear, I mean, they deal with nonviolent crimes, right?
That's exactly right. And what could be more nonviolent than driving a car with your boyfriend next to you and having and committing a crime that you don't know about, and you're just driving a car? That, to me, was just ominous, and we should do something about it. And we still need to do something about that. There's some other things I don't like that we need to correct going forward, and that may be the second step. The third step ought to be stacking, what I call stacking penalties. When you have a simple possession of something and you get it, some other simple thing stacked onto it and stacked onto it, and you have these concurrent sentences going, something that might be 6 months to a year turn out to be 3 to 10 years because you're stacking these things. That's still there. We need to get rid of that. That's what was going on in Ferguson, Missouri, back in the day when you had people committing an offense in one little jurisdiction and driving to the next and being stopped. And sometimes because the guy ahead was warned that here comes a car with a tail light that's out, you get stopped again. And we had one person that got stopped 3 times for the same tail light in little jurisdictions. And then they got all fines about the people who could not afford to pay the fine in the first place. So having this kind of stuff we need to get rid of, and that's still in this bill.
You're back in the majority. It was 8 years. I imagine you missed the majority.
Oh, yes, I came in the majority back in 92, served for 1 term, then went into the majority for 2 terms. So of my 26 years in the House of Representatives, I've spent 20 in the minority. And let me tell you, having been a lifetime in a minority, that ain't fun sometimes.
Well, this year didn't start exactly with Kumbaya on Capitol Hill. You had the shutdown, the longest shutdown ever, and then you had a deal, and now you've got the emergency. But there has been some bipartisanship in the last Congress, criminal justice reform, as well as opioid legislation. With all the Robert Mueller report is now expected soon, and in the wake of this shutdown, can stuff get done? Can this White House and Congress, which is split, get stuff done this year, whether it's drug pricing or transportation?
Well, I would like to say infrastructure rather than transportation, because that gets us to where we can really put together bipartisan legislation. To me, we need a big, comprehensive, I would say $1.5 trillion infrastructure program. And we need to define it for the American people in such a way that it's more than roads and bridges. It's about water and sewage. It's about broadband deployment. It's about building schools in low-income communities. I would love to see a big, comprehensive infrastructure program applying my little 10, 20, 30 formula to it, which means that when we appropriate this money, in whatever category it may be appropriated, in that category, at least 10% of all that money should be spent in communities where the census tells us 20% or more of the population's been stuck beneath the poverty level for the last 30 years. 10, 20, 30. That has had tremendous success in the few areas, 15 areas of the appropriation bills where we have it. But what it guarantees is that you can spend money in communities of need. You can put your resources where they will have the most good for the most people, rather than having all the money going to areas where you have sophisticated grants writers who can know how to dot I's and cross T's, can write a good proposal, but may not have as much need. So I want to see a big, comprehensive infrastructure bill. I think we can get there on a bipartisan basis, because when you put all of this other stuff in there outside of roads and bridges, you are going to reach a lot of low-income rural communities, people who have votes, but may not have a lot of resources.
We have a few minutes for questions from the audience, so if you can identify yourself and ask your question. And actually, in the CNN town hall last night, Senator Sanders embraced your 10-20-30 plan.
Oh, he did?
He did. So there you go.
Well, I might take another look at him.
So yeah, raise your hand if you have a question, and if you can identify yourself. Hold on, wait for the mic.
Good morning, Representative Clyburn. I'm a criminal justice reform lobbyist with FCNL. My question is, how long do you think until we see that second step? I know a lot of people that I work with in my coalitions, we were concerned about the first step in being that it would be the only step for a long time. So I'm just curious, when do you think?
Well, it's a good question, but I have faith that as things go along, we'll be able to take the second step. Let's take on the 18-1 thing. I really believe that we can get there rather quickly. I think we can get there rather quickly on the stacking thing. There's some other things here that we might be able to do rather quickly. The dam has broken, and so I think we can move on some of this. But once again, I would say, as I always say, please, let's not refuse to take the first step just because we can't see our way down to the last step or steps 5 and 6. I was born and raised in the parsonage. I didn't follow my father into the ministry, but I still studied the Bible quite a bit. And one of my favorite verses of the Bible is in Hebrews 11th chapter, the first verse. Faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. And so I have faith that the stuff that you can't see right now is worth hoping for.
We have time for about one more, I think.
Hi, Stacy Bridges from Veterans Vision. I was wondering how the First Step Act will protect the mentally ill who are being housed in prisons right now. How will that law protect the most vulnerable people?
Very good. And that is, as I understand it, Dirk Collins may be on later to correct me on this if I'm wrong. There are some areas dealing with mental illness as well as juveniles that we wanted to take a bigger first step on, which we were not able to do. And so in this second and third step, that may be one of the areas where I think it would be relatively easy to move going forward. But you have a very good point. And I'm not an expert in this field. My job is to count the votes and get us to 218. I don't spend as much time in this area of legislation as I spend on infrastructure. As you can see, I'm a big infrastructure guy, a big historic preservation stuff, national heritage corridors, creating rural policies that will allow rural communities to participate in what I call mainstream economies. This kind of stuff I spend a lot of time on. So I may be wrong about that, but I think I'm right.
Well, we've run out of time. Please thank Congressman Clyburn for joining us this morning. I'll hand it back to Jack. Thanks, Congressman. Hey, appreciate it.